I'm an atheist. I don't believe in the existence of gods. I don't believe in the existence of souls, spirits, or ghosts. I don't believe in an afterlife. I accept the scientific consensus on the origin and age of the universe, the origin and age of our planet, the evolution of life on our planet, including of our species. I believe the metaphysical claims and many of the historical claims of religions are false or unfalsifiable and therefore not to be accepted. I believe science classes should teach science, regardless of the religious beliefs of the students or their parents. I believe religious convictions, however sincerely held, should never be accepted as excuses for prejudice or intolerance. I believe an uncomfortable truth is preferable to a comfortable untruth. I believe we should strive to believe more true things and fewer false things. I believe all of that. And I believe Sam Harris is an asshole. I used to be a fan of Sam Harris, and I'm not the only one. Many of Harris's most ardent critics are people who previously considered him an ally, a role model, a paragon of reason and intellect, I dare say. Like them, I first encountered Harris about 15 years ago when his book The End of Faith was published. I was just starting to come around to the reality that I was an atheist, and that I really had always been one. Despite my best efforts to believe in some form of God, in some kind of an afterlife, I never really thought those things existed, no matter how much I may have wanted them to. And Harris's voice, along with those of the other so-called four horsemen of New Atheism, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and Daniel Dennett, was an important one to me. He was a confident, unapologetic critic of the dubious historical and moral bases of religion, and of the often unduly powerful role it played in society, and particularly government. He was able to identify why religious belief could be such a negative, destructive force, and articulate that with striking clarity. I appreciated that. I went back to college about a year or so after The End of Faith was published. At some point relatively early on, second year I think, I befriended a fellow student who was also an atheist and a Harris fan. He loaned me his copy of Letter to a Christian Nation, the essay Harris published as a follow-up to The End of Faith. I took it home and read it that night. In fact, I read the whole thing in one sitting, out loud, to my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife. That's how you know your partner is truly there to stay. You read an entire Sam Harris book to them, and they stick around. I would not recommend that anyone else try that, by the way. Because I used to be a fan of Harris, because I read his writing, watched his debates, listened to his podcast, I didn't reach the conclusion that he's an asshole based on what other people said about him. I reached that conclusion based on what Sam Harris has been telling me about himself through his words and actions for years. I jumped off the Sam Harris train a while ago, but this has been on my mind recently because of a series of exchanges I witnessed on Twitter over the past few weeks. Following the Christchurch shootings, where 50 Muslims were murdered at their mosques by an anti-Muslim extremist, Mehdi Hasan published a piece calling out the role anti-Muslim rhetoric plays in inciting such hate crimes. In the piece, Hasan notes how much the Christchurch shooters' manifesto sounds like the sorts of things prominent politicians and commentators have been saying for years. One of the commentators Hasan quotes specifically is Sam Harris, who has said Islam is the motherlode of bad ideas, and famously declared in 2004, in reference to the war in Iraq, that we are not at war with terrorism, we are at war with Islam. Harris responded to Hasan's article by tweeting out a clip of Hasan saying some pretty ugly, offensive stuff about gay people, atheists, and non-Muslims. Hasan responded to that by pointing out that he regrets saying those things, has repeatedly acknowledged he was wrong to say them and apologized for them, and no longer holds those views. Then Hasan tweeted a lengthy thread of the many offensive things Harris has said over the years, nearly all of them about Muslims, linking directly to Harris's own writings and podcasts so that anyone who wanted to follow up could get the full context of what Harris was saying. Then Harris responded to that by challenging Hasan to retweet a 6-year-old article Harris wrote to defend himself against the many accusations of bigotry and intolerance that have been directed at him. Hassan did retweet that article and pointed out that it only addresses a handful of the things in Hassan's thread. So let's stop there. I only mentioned this particular interaction between Hassan and Harris because it's what compelled me to make this video now. Harris has been arguing with people over his views on Islam for virtually his entire public life, insisting all the while that his critiques are perfectly reasonable and it's totally unfair to label him anti-Muslim. That's his standard move when pressed on any of his statements. He's never wrong, you see. It's just that the person criticizing him hasn't understood what he was trying to say. And even though that has happened over and over and over again throughout Harris's career, it's never his fault. He can't help it that his words are always being twisted around by all those bad faith apologists for Islam, like P.Z. Myers, and Ina Muhammad Smith, and Dan Errol, and Thomas Smith, and Ryan Bell, and Amanda Marcotte, and Greta Christina, and Rebecca Watson. Let's look at that response to controversy piece he asked Mehdi Hasan to retweet, because I think it's a great example of what I'm talking about. In the article, Harris responds at length to criticisms of his views on Islam. He also addresses criticisms of his views on racial profiling, preemptive nuclear strikes, and torture, all of which he has expressed support for. Though, to be fair, he only ever said that a preemptive nuclear strike may be necessary, and then only if the targets were Islamists. And he admitted that, gosh, it sure would be a shame if we had to do that. Harris's defense of his position that it might be necessary to launch a preemptive nuclear strike if Islamists acquired long-range nukes of their own is to simply restate his position, because obviously the people who had a problem with what he said didn't get it the first time. But I don't think that's the case. People didn't object to what Harris said about preemptive nuclear strikes because they thought he was advocating that we should start dropping nukes on majority Muslim countries immediately. They objected to the fact that Harris, completely of his own volition, created a hypothetical scenario where a preemptive nuclear strike was not only ethical, but necessary, crafted the scenario such that this necessary nuclear strike would be instigated by a threat from Muslims and would kill millions of Muslims, and chose to share this scenario with his readers. It's not an accident that Harris's preemptive nuclear strike scenario involves harming Muslims. His defenses of torture and racial profiling also involve harming Muslims. These aren't desirable things, torture, profiling, preemptive nuclear strikes, Sam wants us to know, but they just might be necessary in the face of the threat posed to Western civilization by radical Islamists. The threat of radical Islamism, or as Harris often shorthands it, Islam, is apparently so dire, so unmatched by anything else in the world, that we should be preparing ourselves to respond to it with methods that would be unthinkable in any other circumstance. Now, I'm not denying the danger represented by terrorist groups like the so-called Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, and others. Those people are criminals and killers, and they should be treated as such. Radical Islamist terrorists are scary. But so are white nationalist terrorists, and we here in the United States are far, far more threatened by them than we are by radical Islamists. And yet Harris doesn't seem nearly as worried about the rise of white nationalist terrorism here and abroad as he does about the scary Muslims. That's one thing I object to about the way Harris talks about Islam and Muslims. He treats the threat posed by radical Islamist terrorism as somehow intrinsically worse than other forms of terrorism. I also don't like the way he refers to the most violent extremists in the Islamic faith as though they represent the whole of Islam. The first controversy to which he responds in his response to controversy piece is his tendency to say repugnant things about Islam and the people who practice it. In the first paragraph of that section, he writes, "Because I am concerned about the logical and behavioral consequences of specific beliefs, I do not treat all religions the same. For instance, a dogmatic belief in the spiritual and ethical necessity of complete nonviolence lies at the very core of Jainism, whereas an equally dogmatic commitment to using violence to defend one's faith, both from within and without, is similarly central to the doctrine of Islam. If you will not concede this point, you will not understand anything I say about Islam. Here's the problem. Many Muslims living in majority Muslim countries, and also here in the West, do not believe their faith contains the doctrine Harris declares to be central to Islam. Harris is taking his reading of the Quran as the only legitimate reading. He interprets it as calling upon the faithful to use violence to defend the faith, and he assumes that those who argue otherwise, including sincere practicing Muslims, are being either dishonest or willfully ignorant about what their religion says. I think that's not only arrogant on Harris's part. Why should his reading of the Quran be treated as the authentic one, especially when it seems to align so closely with that of extremists? It's also unfair to the millions of Muslims who don't find a call to violence in their faith. And it seems to me it also demonstrates a basic misunderstanding of how religion works, which I would think someone like Sam Harris would want to get right, since criticizing religion is kind of what he's famous for. Religions are social constructs. They don't exist solely in the pages of their holy books. They exist through the beliefs and practices of religious people. When Sam Harris says using violence to defend one's faith is a central doctrine of Islam, that is true for some Muslims. But it's also not true for some Muslims. And here's the key point, as I see it. Neither of those groups is right or wrong. There's no such thing as a more authentic form of a religion, because it's all open to interpretation. Sure, you could say, well, the way of believing and practicing a religion that most closely resembles what is written down in the relevant holy books is the most authentic version, but you're still just imposing your own standard for what constitutes an authentic version of that faith on everyone who practices it. And that's on top of the problem of how we determine what is the correct way to read and interpret those holy books. Every sect within a religion as populous and diverse as each of the three major Abrahamic faiths believes its version is the correct version, the version God wants people to practice. As an atheist, I think these disagreements are rather silly because even if you believe the God of a given faith exists, unless that God decides to show up and make a ruling, there doesn't seem to be any way of resolving such disputes. And if no single sect within a faith, such as Islam, has the authority to define what constitutes authentic Islam for everyone else, then neither does anyone from outside that faith, especially one who doesn't actually believe there is such a thing as authentic Islam in the first place. All of this is a very long-winded way of saying that when Sam Harris makes these sweeping declarations about Islam, as though what he's saying applies universally to the entire faith and everyone who practices it, he's not doing anything more than stating his own opinion and treating it as though it were a fact. And he does that a lot. He even does it when engaged in conversation with people who know more about the subject at hand than he does. For example, after he announced that we should begin subjecting Muslims or people who might conceivably be Muslims to additional scrutiny at airport security, he engaged in a written debate with Bruce Schneier, a widely respected expert on security. Throughout the exchange, Schneier explains to Harris, repeatedly and in detail, why his assumptions about the effectiveness of this sort of profiling are wrong, why his proposal to subject Muslims or Muslim-looking people to extra scrutiny wouldn't make anyone any safer, and why racial ethnic profiling is usually a bad idea. In response, Harris dismisses Schneier's objections and keeps insisting that his profiling proposal would work despite all the evidence and expertise presented by Schneier that says it wouldn't. His responses to criticisms of his defense of torture are much the same. When people who have spent far more time studying the subject than Sam Harris insist that besides being morally reprehensible, torture doesn't work and is not a reliable means of gathering information, Harris shrugs off this very significant objection and insists that, well, maybe it doesn't always work, but it still works sometimes, and we should be willing to use it on Muslims. Because the threat of radical Islamist terrorism is just that serious. I'm willing to believe that Harris's anti-Muslim bigotry is not willful. I think it's plausible that he's just that blind to his own biases. But the fact that he doesn't see them doesn't mean they aren't there. You don't spend years and years advocating the use of discriminatory and brutal and ineffective methods against one particular group of people unless you're harboring some prejudice against that group. One controversy Harris doesn't address in his response to controversy is his history of sexism, but that's because he gave that subject an article all to itself. What happened was, back in 2014, Harris was interviewed in front of a live audience at George Washington University. The interview was conducted by Washington Post reporter Michelle Borstein. At one point, Borstein asked Harris why the atheist community in general and his own audience in particular seems so overwhelmingly male. Harris initially answered with a joke, saying the problem must be his own lack of sex appeal. In the article he wrote about this event for his blog, Harris adds, quote, "It is a measure of the ridiculous paranoia engendered by political correctness that in the second it took me to make that joke about my sex appeal, I worried whether my assuming that most women are heterosexual would offend some number of lesbians in the audience." Your mileage may vary, of course, but in my experience, people who complain about the pressure they feel as a result of political correctness tend to be huge assholes. Harris complains about political correctness all the time. Anyway, after the joke about his sex appeal, he went on to address the question about why his own audience seems to consist of mostly men. I think it may have to do with my personal slant as an author, being very critical of bad ideas. There's something about that critical posture that is to some degree intrinsically male and more attractive to guys than to women. The atheist variable just has this. It doesn't obviously have this nurturing, coherence-building extra estrogen vibe that you would want by default if you wanted to attract as many women as men. According to Harris, he was approached by a woman at a book signing after the interview who pointed out to him how sexist his answer to that question was. Harris's response to that woman, according to his own account of it, found in the aforementioned article about the event he published on his blog, was even more sexist and blockheaded than what he'd said on stage. The woman told Harris that what he'd said was sexist and damaging and warranted an apology, and Harris said to her, "You really are determined to be offended, aren't you?" And then she said, "No, you're just totally unaware of how sexist you are." Which is accurate. And then Harris informs this woman that, hey, he was raised by a single mother. He has 2 daughters. His editors have mostly been women. His best editor has always been his wife. And you know what? He actually respects women more than men. In the paragraph following the end of his retelling of the conversation with this woman, Harris anticipates the most obvious objection to his defense of himself by saying that he knows some will think he's making a "some of my best friends are black" argument, but that's totally not what he's doing. He's not saying his relationships with all those women he named prove he isn't sexist. No. That would be fallacious. And Sam Harris is nothing if not a well-honed logic machine. I'm saying that I actually respect women more than men by default, Harris clarifies, adding, I'm not saying that this is necessarily good, I'm saying that it is a fact. See? He's not sexist because he actually respects women more than men. That's a fact that he knows about himself because he's not biased, which he also knows. He concludes his recollection of this encounter with the woman who was determined to be offended by quoting himself saying to her, "I'm not the sexist pig you're looking for." That's also the title of the article. And I think that's perfect. You might recognize that line as a riff on what Obi-Wan Kenobi says to the stormtroopers who stop him, Luke Skywalker, and R2-D2 and C-3PO on their way into Mos Eisley. Obi-Wan gives us our first demonstration of the Jedi mind trick, waving his hand in front of the stormtroopers and telling them, "These aren't the droids you're looking for." Except those are the droids they're looking for. Like I said, perfect. Okay, I know this is already dragging on a bit, and if I wanted this to be a comprehensive accounting of all the shitty things Sam Harris has said, and all the explanations he's offered for why the shitty things he said weren't actually shitty, which only made them even shittier, we would be here for hours, and I don't want that, and I know you don't want that, so let me just touch on one more facet of Harrisian assholism, and then we'll be done. My parents taught me that you can tell a lot about a person by the company they choose to keep. The company Sam Harris chooses to keep is pretty awful. 2 years ago, he welcomed as a guest on his podcast Charles Murray, author of The Bell Curve, a book that has been widely discredited and rejected by the scientific and academic communities for proposing, among other things, that observed differences in IQ between blacks and whites are due in some part to genetic factors. In other words, maybe white folks are just inherently smarter than black folks? Murray has been dismissed by the mainstream scientific establishment, and his work has been likened to the scientific racism of the 19th century that sought to establish an empirical justification for white supremacy. Harris, on the other hand, claimed on the podcast that there was virtually no scientific controversy about Murray's conclusions regarding race and IQ. Not accurate. Even more disturbing, Harris titled the episode featuring his interview with Charles Murray, "Forbidden Knowledge." It's a fact that white people are inherently more intelligent than black people, but we're not supposed to talk about that. That's forbidden knowledge. That's how white supremacists talk. Sam Harris says it like it's the most self-evident, reasonable thing in the world. One of Harris's favorite podcast guests is another person whose last name is Murray, no relation to Charles, but what is it with Harris being all chummy with horrible people named Murray anyway? This Murray is Douglas Murray, a right-wing commentator who, like Harris, has a history of making gross anti-Muslim remarks which he insists are nothing of the kind. They have other things in common too. They hate political correctness, they hate identity politics, and they hate it when people blame them for being too agreeable with racists and misogynists. During an appearance by Murray on his podcast in 2017, Harris laments how people judge him and Murray for having congenial conversations with people like Charles Murray or white supremacist and anti-feminist Stefan Molyneux. Harris complains about how he and Douglas are being condemned to complicity for not finding things to disagree with such people about. Hey, maybe don't have such people on your show at all. Or if you insist on having them on, make sure to talk about things you do disagree about. So the show isn't just you nodding along and saying, you're right. So people listening to your podcast won't get the impression that the scientific racist or the woman-hating white genocide conspiracy theorist is someone legitimate whose voice deserves to be heard. Just a suggestion. Harris hates guilt by association, thinks it's totally unfair. But, as we've already seen, he's 100% on board with innocence by association. He can't be sexist, remember, because of his single mom and all those women he works with, and his wife, and his completely reliable self-diagnosis of pro-woman bias. About a week and a half ago, during his Twitter spat with Mehdi Hasan, someone challenged Harris's understanding of Islam, saying he doesn't have the faintest idea what Muslim belief is. Harris's response? Well, maybe you should ask my Muslim friends. So his response to charges of sexism is literally, how can I hate women, my mom's one, and his response to charges that he doesn't understand Islam is to tag his Muslim and ex-Muslim buddies. The problem isn't that Harris is guilty by association because he associates or has interacted with some truly terrible people. It's not the fact of his associations with these people, it's the nature of those associations, which show that actually Harris isn't all that different than they are. Last year, Harris even went so far as to announce he was quitting Patreon because it had recently banned the likes of Milo Yiannopoulos and professional misogynist and racist troll Carl Benjamin from its platform. Harris insisted that he doesn't share their politics. He just thinks they should be able to earn thousands of dollars a month ranting about how feminists and immigrants are destroying Western civilization and pointing out when a mass shooter makes some good points in his manifesto. Last week, Harris tweeted out an article containing a chart purporting to prove that the members of the so-called intellectual dark web, which includes Harris himself, aren't actually extremists at all. Look, they mostly support abortion rights and gun control and single-payer healthcare. I mean, so what if they spend most of their time attacking feminists and racial justice activists and fear-mongering about immigrants and Muslims and denigrating trans people? Look at all the reasonable positions they have on things they almost never mention. Harris not only associates with bigoted, abusive, intolerant people, he uses his voice and his platform to normalize them. It's not complicity by association. It's complicity. And it's not just complicity either, because Harris has demonstrated over and over again that he's not merely a friend or a defender of such people, he's one of them. Back in 2015, Harris had Douglas Murray on his show to discuss their concerns about what else? Islam and the migrant crisis in Europe. The episode was titled On the Maintenance of Civilization, framing non-white, non-Christian people immigrating to traditionally white Christian regions as a threat to civilization. That's how white supremacists talk. During the episode, they also found time to take a few cheap shots at trans people, with Murray declaring that cis people being asked to recognize and respect trans people would lead to a breakdown of society. You know what? I'll let you hear this bit for yourself.
And let me just say one other thing about this. This whole thing of the weirdo sexual obsession, transgender, trans polygender, identify cis, I've got a penis but I can still win Glamour Woman of the Year award, and who are you if not only do you have to respect me as a woman, if you say I'm not an entire woman despite the fact I've got a penis still, you're a bigot, and then you got to find Caitlyn Jenner attractive. If you don't find her attractive, you don't want to sleep with Caitlyn Jenner, you're an even bigger bigot. This is what, and actually to cite the other person you just said that would trigger you, Sam Harris, Mark Stein said this the other day. This is the conversation we're having when the mullahs will nuke us. Everyone will be discussing whether somebody is transgender despite the fact they've not had any operation. There's a woman in Britain called Jack Monroe, a fatuous far left-wing so-called anti-poverty campaigner, totally talentless individual. This blogger has recently come out as transgender. She says, by the way, she's not going to do anything about it. We just have to call her transgender and regard her as transgender, but she's not going to get a penis put on her, and she's not going to have her breasts reduced or taken off or anything, and she's not going to... We've just got to start calling her a non-sexual pronoun. Now it's theirs for Jack Monroe. The Pink newspaper, I'm gay, I read some of this crap. The Pink newspaper ran a story about Jack Monroe becoming transgender because she says she is. I think she just wants a bit of publicity. They run a piece about her, and they've got to say there. Jack Monroe wrote a piece on their blog saying that when they was younger, I mean, it's an assault on the language apart from anything else. Anyone who cares about our delicate and beautiful language should turn away now. But we'll all be discussing whether somebody who hasn't got a penis can be a man and whether somebody who has got a penis can be Glamour Woman of the Year when the Islamists come in with Kalashnikovs. It's pathetic. It's a breakdown in our society, and you have to rectify it.
Oh, that is hilarious. Well, for those who may just be introduced to you again for the first time in this podcast, there you have a taste of the kind of ire that Douglas is able to summon in the midst of a debate. And that's a gear, unfortunately, which I don't have and wish I did. I think perhaps that part of my brain was damaged by too much meditation. But
it is bad for you. Yeah. It is bad for you.
Well, it's certainly bad for this, and you have this gear, and Hitch obviously had it, and it is incredibly useful. So keep that well oiled.
What's the context I'm leaving out that makes that okay? How am I supposed to interpret that so it's not gross and offensive and bigoted? What charity are these men owed that I'm not giving them? And I'm not just talking about Douglas Murray, who does most of the talking there. Obviously, he's odious, transphobic, Islamophobic. Kudos for managing to vilify and dehumanize both trans people and Muslims in a single rant in the space of just a couple of minutes, by the way. I'm also talking about Harris, who spends most of Murray's bigoted rant giggling like a tickled baby. And what the hell is he laughing at? Murray's not even telling jokes. He's just vomiting anti-trans bile into the microphone, and Harris is yucking it up like he's Ed fucking McMahon watching Johnny Carson do a desk piece. And then at the end, Harris comes in and he says, "Oh boy, I wish I could talk like that. I wish I could cut loose with a hateful screed that links tolerance of trans people to our imminent destruction at the hands of the dread Mohammedans. My brain just doesn't work that way, but gosh, I wish it did." Why are we keeping this asshole around? That's my question that lies at the heart of this little trip through the Sam Harris being a shitty person neighborhood of memory lane. Why is there still a significant portion of the atheist skeptical community that seems determined to protect this bigoted asshole at all costs? Why is this self-impressed know-it-all who compulsively demonizes Muslims while claiming that's not what he's doing, who disrespects women while insisting he actually respects them more, who proudly aligns himself with racists and anti-feminists and xenophobes while insisting that he actually super disagrees with their views, still treated like one of the leading intellectual lights of modern atheism and skepticism? Is it because he can win arguments against creationists and fundamentalists? Because if that's the reason, I've got news for you. Anyone who's ever taken a first-year college biology course or knows how to read critically can win an argument with a creationist or a fundamentalist. It's not that difficult. They don't have the facts on their side, and most of their major claims have been discredited for decades, if not longer. Hey, that sounds familiar. Who does that remind me of? Is it because he's a critic of Islam? Because there are people who stand up to Muslim radicals and fundamentalists who call out bigotry and intolerance within Muslim communities without vilifying all Muslims. Turns out it's totally possible to challenge the harm being done by some Muslims, mostly to other Muslims, without implying that all Muslims would be terrorists if they just followed the doctrines of their faith more accurately. There's nothing Sam Harris can do that other smarter, sharper, kinder, more thoughtful people can't do. The sooner we start finding and paying attention to those people and stop supporting this jackass, the better off we're all gonna be. I believe that too.